I enlisted for reasons that were not very heroic. There was a job fair in town, a recruiter who smiled with too much front teeth, and a pamphlet with pictures of people standing on cliffs looking resolute. My mother said I ought to find something steady. My friends said it would be an adventure. I'd been driving long hours, working shifts that began before dawn and ended after midnight, and the idea of a uniform felt like a promise of order, a place where I could be measured, where expectations were clear and consequences followed a map. I liked maps. I liked the idea that a line could tell you where to go and what to do. I did not know then how often a map would leave out the most important terrain. Boot camp was a clinical excision of my former habits. They told us at the outset, "We will break you down so we can build you up." It's a phrase meant to feel reassuring, like a preface to a transformation. In practice, it felt like surrender. We learned to move in synchronized steps until our individual rhythms felt like a betrayal. We learned to make our beds with razor edges, to shine boots until the leather rejected light, to read orders the way you read a Bible, frequently, with obedience. The instructors used a vocabulary of blunt tools, shame, ridicule, reward, to shape us. It worked. I learned how to be obedient without thinking, how to trust commands more than my own instinct. There was camaraderie in the new language. We traded names, then nicknames, then the kind of secrets that form fast and stick forever. We were young enough to believe toughness was a virtue and innocent enough to think sacrifice was a story you told later at reunions. At night, when the lights went out and the barracks murmured like a living animal, I would look at the faces around me and wonder which of us would remain when the curtain lifted. We joked about medals and promotions and the women we had left behind, but there was an underlying thing we didn't speak of, the knowledge that the country outside still lurked with its own rules, and that some part of all of us was filing away what we were learning for future use. My first deployment arrived like an unannounced second act. The country we went to had nights that were thick and insect-heavy, and mornings that smelled like frying oil and diesel. The language was a tangle I could not speak, and yet theology, commerce, grief, these things were universal in their anatomy. Our unit moved through cities that had been stitched together by histories both ancient and recent. You could see time in the buildings, mosques with ornate tiles, concrete shells still holding the bullet scars of earlier conflicts, market stalls with tarps patched and patched again. The people moved through the spaces with an economy of habit that had learned to ignore the abnormal. Patrols felt like ritualized math. There was a route and a speed and a set of signals that were the tiny grammar of survival. We practiced contingencies until the options felt like instructions rather than choices. There was an intimacy to being constantly on alert with others. You learned the sound of each man's breath, the way someone scanned a rooftop. Those small recognitions were less sentimental and more functional, but they became the scaffolding of a quieter loyalty. You cannot be close to someone in that context without knowing their edges. Combat shredded time into a new geometry. It was not continuous. It arrived as bright, terrible intervals. The first time I saw a man hit by shrapnel, the world distilled into sensory fragments. The bright, terrible smell, the sound of his breath changing, the frantic, practiced choreography of medics. I felt useful and helpless in the same moment. We carried survivors like illicit truths between checkpoints, with the urgency of people who know minutes reshape a life. Behind every action, there was a reason that could be explained in the strict terms we'd been given: rules of engagement, mission objectives, civilian presence. But those reasons did not soften the reality that sometimes you had to choose whom you could save with the resources at hand. We buried men under sun that refused to acknowledge the injustice. There were funerals where uniformed hands folded flags that smelled of starch and dust. Family members who had never slept in our boots received the rectangle of fabric with an expression that belonged to survivors of an entirely different war. We offered words that were thin as paper, condolences, rehearsed prayers, because language felt inadequate. Grief is not something you can ration. It expands and demands room. The names of the dead became a private catalog I recited like litany on long drives back to base. Sometimes I would say them aloud into the dark of a Humvee, as if naming kept them from dissolving into forgetfulness. There were also moments that seemed to be written for a different life. A sunrise so clean it seemed like a promise, a laughing child who balanced precariously on a wall, an old woman selling tea with hands that moved like practiced musicians. It's possible to live in both registers at once. Sorrow and small miracles are not mutually exclusive. The human heart has a capacity to hold contradictions until it becomes its own kind of resilience. When I returned home the first time, I was surprised by the ordinariness of it all. There was nothing cinematic about leaving a place of danger. You got on a plane, sat in a seat, ate the same processed food as everybody else, and finally landed in an airport that smelled of coffee and fluorescent light. My mother hugged me like someone who had been holding a thread in case I reappeared. There were parades of gratitude. People who handed us flags or thanked us in ways that made my cheeks burn with a complicated shame. I wanted to be acknowledged, but I also craved anonymity. How do you reconcile the need for recognition with the wish to be ordinary again? Homefront life was a different kind of discipline. The enemy there was indifference and the slow erosion of attention. People asked about what it was like in ways that were more about their curiosity than my need to be understood. I learned to answer in acts, showing up to my job, being on time for family events, letting a neighbor assume my life was in order. That kind of performance is its own work. It is exhausting to hide the fact that you are carrying something that occasionally leaks. Sleep was where the war followed me most stubbornly. Nightmares have their own logic. They are not just replay. They are reinterpretation. Good days turned into bad ones with a small, cruel edit. You wake with a taste of metallic air, with a heart racing as if you'd run a sprint you cannot remember starting. At first I hid my nights, because privacy felt safer than the vulnerability of confession. Then I found therapy, and it was a complicated relief. There were therapists who sat and nodded in ways that did not demand courage but steadied it, who taught me the ridiculous power of breathing deliberately. I learned to watch my body like an instrument and to notice the small triggers that made it clamp down. It is not glamorous work. It is calling a doctor, filling a prescription, driving to a support group, all of which feel like humiliation and also like saving yourself. Relationships frayed in ways that were slow and then sudden. I loved someone before I left. We wrote letters that tried to cover the distance with the syntax of normal life. When I returned, the novel that had been our life had been rewritten. She had grown in ways I had not. We were both bearers of change. We tried. We negotiated. And then we discovered that love needs presence as much as passion. I failed in ways that still make me wince. I held back, thinking my silence was protection, and in doing so damaged the very connections I wanted to preserve. There is a special kind of selfishness in withholding yourself to avoid burdening the person you love. It seems noble, and it is not. Work offered a new identity, but also a series of small humiliations. Employers praised leadership skills in interviews, but rarely understood the cost of nights spent awake. I found jobs that fit and others that did not. The economy is a bureaucracy of another sort, forms and expectations, and the strange, constant need to prove yourself again. I learned to translate my experience into language that is useful in boardrooms and interviews. I am decisive. I work well under pressure. I lead teams. These phrases are accurate and also incomplete. They do not tell you about the afternoons when I sat in my parked car and wept because the weight of what I had seen overwhelmed me. Community helped. I found a veterans group that met in a church basement on Thursday nights. We drank bad coffee and traded the currency of shared experience. Jokes that are sharper than they appear, stories that can be told because the other person knows what the words mean. You cannot manufacture that intimacy. It grows from repeated exposure, from showing up when showing up is the hard thing. The group became a kind of fraternity of repair. We helped each other with paperwork, drove one another to appointments, and learned how to perform small kindnesses, the things that most effectively dismantle isolation. Parenthood reframed everything. The first time I held my child, I felt a terror robust enough to be almost a physical force. This tiny human would be shaped by me in ways I could not entirely control, and that felt like both privilege and responsibility. Fatherhood taught me both patience and the necessity of showing up. You cannot train a child in a day. You chip away at goodness through repetition, reading bedtime stories, making pancakes, driving them to practice even when you are exhausted. The stakes suddenly became spectacularly clear. You do not want your child to inherit your fears. You do want them to learn courage, but the kind that is honest and soft at the edges. I volunteered at the VA not because of some grandiose sense of duty, but because I recognized the practical value of being present for others. There are rituals there, coffee at 10 a.m., forms to be filled out, a nurse who remembers names, that become small anchors. I helped someone file a claim, rode with a veteran to a job interview, taught a younger guy how to bake a loaf of bread because it steadies a hand and gives you a visible accomplishment at the end of the day. Service continued in these small ways. The big heroics were behind me. The daily acts of care were in front. Sometimes I confronted the truth of politics and war in blunt terms. I had been willing to trust institutions. After a while, I learned to ask questions about strategy, about rules of engagement, about who pays and who profits. Patriotism is not blind, it is interrogative. It requires us to hold our country accountable because the people who serve deserve honesty. The rhetoric of war often tries to simplify sacrifice into slogans that can be used by anyone for any purpose. I grew suspicious of languages that turned complex human suffering into tidy moral narratives. We are owed better transparency, thoughtful planning, and robust care for people who return. There were friendships. I still attend memorials, sometimes because memory is a civic duty and sometimes because I need to say a name out loud. We keep a list at home of the names of the men and women I served with who did not come back. Saying them is not a performance. It is an act of maintenance. Memory fades if you do not exercise it. It is also a way to honor those who cannot speak for themselves. We commemorate not to glorify war, but to humanize its costs. There are days of gratitude, sunlight on a kitchen table, my child's small breath in the night, a neighbor bringing over a casserole unannounced. These things matter because they are ordinary and not orchestrated. They are proof that life continues. They are also scaffolding for a life that might otherwise feel unmoored. Gratitude is not a denial of sorrow. It is the acknowledgement that sorrow and beauty can coexist. Sometimes I imagine a different kind of public life, a country that invests in prevention and diplomacy, that trains fewer people for violence and more people for conflict resolution, that pays attention to the aftercare of those who serve. I am not naive. I understand geopolitics and the complexity of threats, but I also know that the human cost of war is not an externality to be balanced on a ledger. It is an integral part of the equation that must factor into decisions. The uniform eventually becomes a thing you put away for the most part, folded with care and stored where you can find it if needed. Occasionally, I take it out and feel the geometry of it, the way the collar sits, the weight of the fabric. Sometimes I wear a patch at a ceremony and feel the familiar authority of it. Other times I prefer a hoodie and am content to be anonymous. Both are honest. There is honor in public recognition and dignity in private life. If there's one last thing I want to say to anyone listening, veteran or civilian, it's this: be present. Small, steady presence changes lives more than one-off grand gestures. Call your friends. Sit with someone who is grieving. Ask what help looks like and take their answer seriously. Keep the names of the lost in your mouth as proof that memory is not optional. Teach children that courage is not only about force, but about being there for others. Insist that political leaders account for the people they ask to risk their lives. Demand systems that care for the living as well as honoring the dead. The echoes are always there, the crack of a distant memory, the rhythm of a night watch. But they have become part of a larger chorus. There is laughter in my house, even on bad days. There is the smell of coffee and the slap of a basketball against pavement. There are small rituals we keep because they hold meaning. A Sunday walk, the way we fold blankets, the slow choreography of bedtime. These ordinary things are not small at all. They are the architecture of survival. I do not need to be defined by what happened in uniform. I can be more than one story. I hold the past with the tenderness of someone who knows the cost of forgetting, and I live forward with the stubbornness of someone who has learned that even small, ordinary days can be sources of redemption. In the long silence after the gunfire, we find ways to be human again, awkward, imperfect, resilient, and that is as brave as any battlefield.